Hari Om everyone. Today, many places Janmashtami is being celebrated, so we have 2-3 minutes just before we start. We will watch a small clip of Gurudev where he is explaining to some children about Kaliya Mardan.
Snake or serpent, in all religious literature, represents the base or sensuous mind. Whether it is Adam and Eve and the snake comes and tells him, or when there is the Lord Shiva has got the snake on his neck and the hands and as ornaments for him. Everywhere the meaning of the snake, the symbol is for the lower mind. Shiva has controlled the lower mind and it has become a beauty, an ornament. Kaliyan, the many-mouthed or hooded animal, snake, as our mind is. By our mouth we can talk only to one person, one language, one sentence. But the mind can talk 100 things together at one same time. Because it has got hundreds. Hundreds of mouths. Thus Kaliyan, poisonous, giving ashanti to everybody and death and disaster to everyone, was poisoning the lake. Lord Krishna, Lord baby Krishna, jumped on to it and jumped on his head. See that he's standing dancing. And Kaliyan is trying to destroy him, but he is becoming heavier, heavier, heavier until at last the snake was tired, vomited all his poison and said, "Save me, don't destroy me." So they're all right. Get out of this place and don't poison this place, okay? In the same way, my children, you are vulgar, dirty, filthy, bad, abusive language and various other minds with raga, dvesha, desires, passion. That mind, if you constantly remember Krishna, to control the mind in contemplation and devotion, we keep Krishna on the snake in us, the poisonous snake in us, and the snake in us. This is called the Kaliya Mardan. So, your birthday is not a cake that you want to cut, but you must come here, pray to the Lord. Hey Krishna, 1 year more passed, my mind is still there, Kaliyan is still there, dance on, dance on, dance on Krishna, and then offer a gift to Krishna. Okay? Birthday is not a birthday unless we go there to Kaliya Mardan. Okay? Right.
Okay, so that was a simple, nice, beautiful explanation of Gurudev. Wish you all also a very happy Janmashtami. Let's begin our session today. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sah Viryam Karvavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramardanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishnam Vande Jagadgurum. Samasta Jana Kalyane Niratam Karunamayam Namami Chinmayam Devam Sadgurum Brahma Vidvaram. Okay, so we were on the 4th chapter. We had done the first verse. Just give me a minute. So we were on the 4th chapter and we saw how the knowledge which the Lord has given in the Gita is a time-tested knowledge which he himself gave to the sun, meaning at the time of creation itself this knowledge was available. And it passed on to Ikshvaku, to Manu, that way. So from Vivaswan to Manu, Manu to Ikshvaku. And it was said that in time, this knowledge also started declining. So we will see that aspect. Last time we saw about dharma, we also saw about Samskriti. So our whole culture is Adhyatmic Samskriti, and the basis of our culture is this knowledge, Adhyatma. And so we find that we had one question. Last time, if you remember, your homework was that. What was the homework? Should dharma influence politics or not? So if you have thought about it, write in the chat window. Should dharma influence politics or not? It should influence. Okay. All politicians must walk on the path of dharma, right? Yes, dharma should influence politics. All right. No. Okay. So one person has said no. Would you like to explain why no? Because the yes, some people have explained that people should walk path of dharma. So no, why should dharma not influence politics? It should be the basis of being a righteous leader. Okay. Yes. Dharma should influence politics because governance of a nation should be done on the path of dharma. Right. Please remember, by the meaning dharma, we are not saying any religion. Dharma we saw already. That dharma is that which upholds, unites, binds. That is called dharma. And the word religion is a very inadequate translation of the word dharma. Dharma is the vision of life, where I learn to live with righteousness, with values, with a certain selfless vision, with a higher purpose. And in that way, it should definitely influence every aspect, not just politics. Our relationships, our work environment, our personal goals, how we are with ourselves. It should influence our entertainment. Everything should be influenced by dharma. Yes, it should be all pervasive, and being dharmic does not imply lack of strategy. Yes. See, the suffering happens because we swerve from the path of dharma. And dharma, when we have translated as religion, and then the notion of secularism which has come inside, that has created all the disturbances in our mind. Literally, the meaning of the word secularism means the government is above religion. Government does not have to do anything with religion. And the word secularism was not even there in our constitution when it was formed. It was added during the emergency without the consent of people. It was just, inserted inside. So, and from then onwards, when people use the word secularism, long back it was harmony of all religions. Then it became appeasement of certain minorities. Then it became appeasement of one particular minority. Then it became further degenerated for vote bank politics and further degenerated to become hating Hindus. Secularism means hating Hindus. And who are the people who are hating? Majority are Hindus only. That's the sad thing. In the name of being secular, we are hating our own culture. Our own dharma we are hating. Our own Samskriti we are hating. And we take pride in that. So in that sense, when we are looking at it, then we want to say that no, religion should be above, the government should be above dharma. It should not cater to any, but that is not what is the point here. The point here is that the righteous values, that which upholds, that which unites, that which helps to integrate everybody, that is dharma. And that must be applied everywhere. Because if that is not applied, then we find all this happening, corruption, and where is democracy? When you can rig the election, where is democracy? Think about that. Where it's just power, it's just a money game. Then dharma is gone from the back door. Then there is no righteousness, and you can't expect a nation's progress and development cannot happen unless there is the commitment, there is dedication, there is righteousness, there is transparency. All that is very, very important. So dharma is a very important aspect of life. And now we see here in this 4th chapter, it is said that this knowledge of being selfless, being righteous, that foundation of dharma is this adhyatmic jnana, is the spiritual knowledge. That's why it is very important that we anchor in this knowledge. I may say I'm a, follower of my dharma, but from where is dharma coming? Dharma is rooted in the jnana, in the knowledge. Adhyatmic jnana, and our culture based on that, and then dharma is expression which we use in every aspect of our life. So this knowledge over a period of time goes through decadence. I'm going to continue the presentation which we had seen last time. Okay. So earlier dharma influenced everything, including politics, and today politics is influencing everything, including dharma, where the word dharma now means just, the religious aspect. That's how we have narrowed it down, and politics affects everything. It should not be that way. It should be the other way. Dharma must influence everything. That's what our knowledge and our culture says, that we should live in a more dharmic way. So now in the 2nd verse here, he says that this knowledge in time, the demand reduces. Evam parampara praptam imam rajarshayo viduhu sakale neha mahata yogo nashta parantapa. Yogo nashta means the knowledge doesn't get destroyed. The demand for it reduces, and people, when demand reduces, obviously takers are few, then the givers also become less, and the followers become much, much lesser then. So we find that over a period of time, many, many things that we followed in our dharma, which we used to do earlier, like a simple example, if I have to give you, Gayatri Mantra Japa. How many people follow the Gayatri Mantra Japa today? sincerely, regularly, every morning, do it in the traditional way as the Sandhya Vandan, which we learned. How many people do it? Can anybody, can you respond, please? I just want to understand. I do it every day. Yes, only in the morning. Yes, chanting 3 times. Okay. Yes. So it's great. I mean, it's great. Some people are doing it. Trikala, wonderful. 3 times. Excellent. Morning before sleeping, once in a day. Okay. I do it every day. Great. See, this is just one simple technique. I'm just saying that Gayatri Mantra was a part of our culture and everybody used to get initiated. It's a myth to think that, Gayatri Mantra is only for Brahmanas. It is meant for all, including women also. And they used to get Janev Samskar also. They used to be Rishi Patnis also. They used to teach in the Vedic Gurukuls also. So it was a simple tradition. And how much in time we have got into those wrong notions that, women can't chant Gayatri Mantra. Women are to be denied the Vedic knowledge. That's a decadence of the culture. Why? Because human mind goes through decadence. The higher values people are not able to follow. They fall for the Bhautikvad, which is the material culture where they, are happy with just some sense indulgences. The deeper values to live, they are not able to do. So over a period of time, many things like that get lost. What was the intention, how it is practiced, completely gets, in opposite ways also sometimes. And hence it is necessary to revive such declining traditions and cultures. Wherever this doesn't happen, all those cultures get wiped out. You see, Greek civilization, Roman civilization, Mesopotamian civilization, Mayan civilization, so many of these are wiped out. One of the reasons is they did not adapt to the changing times and did not become relevant for the changing times. Adaptability is very important. Other reason also is the Abrahamic faiths have come and destroyed most of the religions, most of the cultures across the world. Ours is the only surviving culture. From pre-Bronze Age till today, ours is the only surviving culture, and we have stood all the onslaughts and the attacks by the invaders and refused to convert without compromise, held on to our culture, values, and people have fought, people have sacrificed. That's how the culture is surviving today, what it is. It's a living, thriving culture, the oldest culture in the world. So that is because people have lived uncompromisingly, and time to time great masters have come to revive it. So effort of many generations is required to build a culture, but to lose the culture, apathy of one generation is enough. If one generation says, I don't want to do this, I refuse to follow this, that's it. The next generation will not even know what was happening because they cut the chain, they cut the link. So many traditions like that we just lose. Even simple traditions we lose because we think it is old, outdated, superstitious, not relevant. Adaptability, in that there is no doubt, something which we really find superstitious, we can leave, and we have done that also. But without knowing the real principle, the real significance, real application, we just, blindly just stop because we are told, oh, this is all myth. How many people celebrate festivals in a deep way, meaningful way, purposeful way? We can carpet it because everybody tells us like that. Every single festival of ours has some problem, and we are the sitting ducks for all the people to go on attacking us. In Janmashtami, you should not do dahi handi. In Holi, you should not play with colors. You should not waste water. In Shivratri, you should not offer milk to Lord Shiva. It goes on. Navratri, you should not play dandiya beyond 10 o'clock. Arey, come on, every single festival of ours, there is some problem that people have. And they don't have guts to speak about for any other religion. And we also follow that. So we stop doing so many things. By time change, no doubt. And what is declined, revive it again. Earlier days when the Abhisheka was done on the Shivlinga, the water as well as the milk, etc., is collected and distributed as tirtham. It's not wasted. If today that is getting wasted, instead of saying why should I offer milk, we should figure out how should we learn to gather all that and distribute to people. And it is powerful because mantras are chanted with bhavana. It is offered that milk has tremendous power. Offer it. Let distribute it to people. That's the way to adapt, to change, to apply, not to just reject. To reject doesn't require much intelligence. To adapt requires intelligence. That's what we have to do as a community. We should not be just simply rejecting. Test it, understand it, what is the significance, how to make it adaptable. That's what all great masters did. So, as youth, we must have that responsibility, correct the mistakes of the past, revive the glorious traditions again. Why do those traditions go through decadence? They go through decadence because the value system changes. The mind has become very weak. Weak mind means what? Durbala, which values only lower tendencies and pleasures, which doesn't have strength to live values uncompromisingly. That's a weak mind. Completely victim of the senses. How many people have guts to say no to their friends when the friends tell you to drink, drink alcohol or to smoke cigarette or, to eat tobacco? That requires guts, not to fall for peer pressure, because from no standpoint, it is good for us. Science also tells very clearly that alcohol literally destroys the gray cells in the brain. Already the gray cells are less. And now drink alcohol and destroy all those also. Plus it makes my discrimination completely, it eclipses my discrimination. So I don't know what I'm speaking, what I'm doing. Bodily also it is the cause of obesity, cholesterol, heart issues, heartburn, so many things. Just think about it. And next day morning hangover, plus that time also one goes on vomiting. I mean, what? But social drinking, it's cool to drink, and one starts drinking, one feels I have arrived, I've, graduated from a child to a mature young person or an adult. That's not the sign of manliness. That's not the sign of being adult. The capability to reject it when I know it is not good for me and for my family, for the relationships, I reject it, and I have nothing against anybody who is doing it, but I don't want it. Don't force me to have it. That mind strength must be there, not to compromise. I'm just giving one example. Drugs, alcohol, cigarette, tobacco, pan masala, all that is so harmful and it destroys the potential of the youth. And there are such conspiracies to destroy that potential because India is a very young country. We need to wake up to that fact, and where that money goes, many times it goes to unlawful activities and to use to attack our country. Unmindful of all that, one is indulging only through senses, then that person is called weak and unqualified, meaning has not studied the scriptures and not understood the culture properly. So intellect is not having knowledge, mind is not having strength, senses there is no control. In the name of liberal thinking, freedom and not following rules, being open-minded about many things, one goes on indulging mindlessly. One is a slave of the mind actually. So when this mind of ours is like this, then how it will live higher culture? So that's why he says here that sakale neha mahata. In time, this knowledge goes through decadence. And are we not finding that the lack of this knowledge is why we see so many things happening? Even successful people going through stress, worry, tension, depression, anxiety, youngsters committing suicide, all that is happening. Why? Because inner strength is not there to anchor. Senses are not being controlled. Nobody teaches us sense control. Anybody teaches us in the world outside? You have to come to spiritual knowledge, Adhyatmik Samskriti to learn sense control. People to will tempt with more and more objects, only their market has to run. Their targets have to be filled, and you are the guinea pig for it. You meaning each one of us. It's up to us how much we discriminate and we allow ourselves to get exploited for their purpose, and how much we stand for our values and our convictions. I know there are people who have stood up for their values and convictions, and they are leading successful lives. They are leading happy lives also. Not that it is extreme. If you leave all that, your life will become boring. Not at all. It's much more interesting, inspiring, and much more enjoyable also. So there are such nice, refined ways of enjoyment. Today, what do we do in the name of enjoyment? If we want to celebrate, we drink alcohol. If we are depressed, we drink alcohol. At all times, we are drinking alcohol. That is not strong youth. If the youth have to really do something for themselves and for the country, we must have these three capabilities. Our senses must be in control. Our mind must be strong with positive emotions and inspiring vision for the future, and our intellect must be rooted in clear knowledge. That person will go through life and its challenges successfully and achieve something worthwhile. So now here he says that this knowledge, what he gave, has gone through decadence, and whenever this knowledge goes through a decadence, so went back. Yeah. So whenever this knowledge goes through decadence, there are great people who have come to revive this culture again. And sometimes when it is not possible by them, then the Lord himself has to come. Now when Bhagwan says this, that he gave this knowledge to son, we will come to that point. Arjun raises a question, but I want you to answer this question, that we just said that whenever dharma declines, some great saints come to revive it. Name a few saints who revived our dharma. Gurudev, Swami Chinmayanand, okay, Adi Shankaracharya, great, Swami Vivekananda, Narsi Mehta. Narsi Mehta, by his life, he did it as an example, no doubt. I'm asking about missionary saints. Yes, Tulsidas ji, Vivekanand ji, Vedavyas ji, Ramanujacharya, Ramana Maharshi, Madhavacharya ji, Srila Prabhupada, okay. Periyar, yes. Swami Shivanand ji, yes, one of the most greatest missionaries. Chattambi Swamigal, yes, Sri Aurobindo. Swami Vidyaranya, wonderful. Tapan Maharaj, he did it on his own as an individual, and he produced one Swami Chinmayanand, but he didn't go around making people, with that kind of a spirit that Shivanand and other masters did. In his own right, he was a great master and he influenced people. Kabir Das, Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. Again, Ramakrishna Paramahamsa is like that. He lived and experienced the divine, and he shared it with the devotees around. He didn't go around with a missionary zeal to make people live this culture, but he produced a Vivekananda who did it. Sai Baba, Tyagaraja, Surdas, yes, Swami Ram Tirtha, Samarth Ramdas, wonderful. Yes, the whole Guru Parampara of all the Shankaracharyas, right? Pramukh Swami Maharaj, right? So you see, from across different sampradayas in our culture, different saints, different Mahatmas have come who have dedicated their life to revive this culture, to protect this, to preserve this glorious tradition. Many such people who have given their life for it. We should listen, we should read about these people's lives, how they have lived, what have they done, how they have revived the culture, what strategies did they apply. And they also face a lot of challenges and obstacles. How did they counter all of that? What was the situation of that time and what was their response? Same way, then we will be able to understand what is the present scenario in our country about our culture, And what should be our response? We will be able to then come out based on our study. And one common thing in most of them would be they would be anchored in the knowledge. All the examples that you gave, they all are anchored in knowledge, in devotion, in the depth of our culture. So this must be very clearly understood, that until we do not study, we do not get anchored in this knowledge and live it in our life, revival is not possible. We can keep talking about cultural revival, but our life will be exactly opposite. That should not happen. So now when Bhagwan said this, that he gave this knowledge to Surya, Arjun has a question. And naturally any skeptic person also would have that question, that, oh Krishna, don't try to bluff me. He says, Arjuna vacha, aparam bhavato janma, param janma vivasvataha, katham etad vijaniyam tvamhadav proktavaniti. Oh Krishna, you are born later. You are just born a few years before me. We have grown together. Aparam bhavato janma. Param janma vivasvata. And sun is at the beginning of creation. Now whom are you trying to bluff? Why are you telling me that you gave this knowledge to sun? How is that possible? This is the spirit of questioning in our culture. You see such beautiful aspect. Can anybody else question? There is a freedom of questioning is in Hindu culture. Amazing. The teacher can be questioned. And Gurudev used to sometimes humorously joke, and he would say, the student can hold the teacher by collar and make him answerable, saying, what are you bluffing me? Tell me what is the meaning of this. Of course, it's figurative, not literal, but the point is that the freedom to question is there. If you don't understand anything, ask. So here is asking, how do I believe this? Just because Krishna is saying he is an authority and people have to accept. That is not our culture here. It can be any great authority, but if it doesn't pass the logical reasoning and the experiential proof, then impossible. We won't accept. That was our culture. That's our culture even today. Dissent, what modern people say, dissent. Dissent is allowed in our culture right from the beginning. All scriptures are a result of dissent and questioning only. You can be a non-believer and you can still be a Hindu. That's the beauty of it. So now, when Arjuna asked this question, this is for something for us to think. That it's a valid question. Krishna is born few years before Arjuna, and sun is at the time of creation. So why is it said by Krishna that he gave this knowledge to sun? Anybody type the answer? Rebirth. Okay, so Krishna had rebirth. He is the Supreme Lord. Okay, many births before. So yes, rebirth again. So you also believe in rebirth, Jahan. Okay, Krishna is referring to his true nature. Okay, great. Incarnation. But incarnation happened now. He gave the knowledge to sun that time. Supreme consciousness. He is avatar of Vishnu. Avatar happened now. That's the question now. Krishna remembers past life. Whose past life? Krishna has a past life. That's the question now. Rebirth. Two questions right now. With all your answers, now there are two questions. Question number one is that Krishna is born as any other individual, and does he have past life? Second, Krishna is born right now. So how can he give knowledge to the sun there? Krishna had many births. Acha. The creator of everything. Ishvara. Didn't he die because he was in I can't read. He was in human form. Okay, yeah, he died, but so he's Akala. Same Brahman who gave this knowledge to the sun is the same Brahman who in form of Krishna is giving knowledge to Arjuna. Okay, good. I think there are many elders on this group. Elders are banned on this group, by the way. Don't do adharma by being on this group, please. See on YouTube quietly. Follow the instructions what have been given. Just like humans have many births, Krishna too took many births to give knowledge. Imprints in him which he understood, that great yogi. Okay. So now that is what we have to understand now, that what is the answer that Bhagavan gives, you see. In this answer is very nice. The answer is the understanding of avatar. So when we try to understand, now before I go into avatar concept, can God take avatar, yes or no? That you have to explain first. Yes, 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 yes. Why not? Yes, 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 yes. Only God can. Excellent. Yes, for the good. Yes, yes. Okay, that's amazing. I'm happy to read that. But do you know that other religions don't believe God can take avatar? Number one. Even in Hinduism, there are many sects which don't believe in avatar. They don't say that God can take avatar. Either if God is Nirgun Nirakar, absolute truth, won't take avatar, or is Ishvara, who has qualities but no form. So how will he take avatar without form? So there are many sects which don't believe in avatar, even in Sanatan Dharma. We should remember that. We should not think that everybody in Hinduism believes. People may, if they are ascribing to a specific philosophy, then if they are deep in that philosophy, in that they should find out whether they believe in avatar or not. Vedant Parampara believes in avatar. So Dvaita Vedanta, Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, all will believe. Dvaita Vedanta, where God and human are different from each other and human being is a servant of the Lord. Vishishtadvaita means human being is not completely different. Human being is a part of God. God is the whole, human being is a part. And Advaita Vedanta says essentially we are one with God. Body, mind, intellect are different. We have individual body, mind, intellect. Bhagavan has total. So Vedanta believes in avatar. Not necessarily all schools of philosophy believe in avatar. Not necessarily. Remember this because sometimes you will be surprised. Suddenly some Hindus also will say Bhagavan doesn't take avatar. Don't get surprised there. Because it's a fact. They don't believe in that. Now, when we say, can God take avatar? We should understand one aspect here, that when we say that knowledge was given by the Lord to the Son, there are 4 standpoints of Krishna in the Gita. First standpoint is as Brahman, which is supreme truth, which is changeless, absolute reality, which is infinite, in which there is no creation, there is no creator, there is no creature. Because infinity means that which is beyond time, space, objects. That is called infinite, which cannot change at all. Anything changes is finite. It is, in time it will change and it will perish. Infinite is changeless. So that is the highest state, which is called Brahman, in which there is no duality. But you and I are seeing this creation. So from where this creation came? So that supreme infinite Brahman, using the power of Maya, assumes the identity of creator called Ishvara. That Ishvara creates, sustains and destroys. So in the Gita, Krishna is depicted as Brahman also, changeless truth. Krishna is depicted as Ishvara also. Then Krishna is depicted as an avatar. That Ishvara can take avatar as the son of Vasudeva and Devaki here in this context of Krishna. Any other avatars also he can take. And there are many such avatars. Vishnu Bhagavan doesn't have only 10. That is popular concept, Dasha-avatar. But Bhagavan has many avatars. In fact, they are countless. Even Bhagavatam gives majorly some 24, 25, different places it gives different numbers. But countless are avatars of Bhagavan. He is not limited by only 10. So that Lord who is Ishvara, the creator, can manifest as one form. And then that form has specific attributes. Son of Vasudeva, Devaki, the blue boy of Vrindavan, the cowherd, the king of Dwarka, all that, specific attributes. And then fourth one is, he is the guru of Arjuna. In the Gita, these are 4 standpoints. Now you have to tell me that the question that Arjuna asked, that he gave this knowledge to son. Krishna gave Krishna says he gave this knowledge to son. Which standpoint is he talking about from these four? Ishvara, Brahman, Ishvara, 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 Ishvara. Majority said Ishvara. Two people have said Brahman. Think about it. Can Brahman give knowledge? Or some more people now in support of Brahman. Brahman support has increased suddenly. Ishvara. Brahman is infinite, so no. That's the point to think about. Where, when I spoke about Brahman, I said Brahman is infinite, changeless, attributeless, beyond space-time object. So there is no duality in that. So where is the question of giving anything to anybody? And as Krishna to avatar is just now, so Arjuna is asking, that is the question. So Brahman negated, Krishna negated, Guru of Arjuna negated. What remains? Avatar only. Sorry, Ishvara only. As Ishvara, the creator, he is before sun or not? And he has created this whole universe. So through his mind only he created, and through that only this whole Srishti is appearing. And he gave this knowledge. As Ishvara, he gave this knowledge. And as Ishvara, only Ishvara takes avatar here. Please remember that. Ishvara only is taking avatar. Brahman doesn't take any avatar. Because no duality again. That Ishvara is in form of Krishna here. And so in the answer, Bhagavan says this, Bahuni me vyatitani janmani tava charjuna tani aham veda sarvani natvam veta parantapa. I have spent many lives before. You have also gone through many lives before. I remember all of them. You don't remember all of them. Bhagavan remembers all his previous incarnations as well as the reincarnations of Jiva, Arjuna. But Jiva doesn't remember his own past life, nor does he remember Bhagavan's life. Now please remember, when he says, I have spent many lives, does not mean Bhagavan takes rebirth. No, there is no rebirth for Bhagavan. When he says many lives, it means many incarnations. I will explain this as we go along, but just remember this fact, that Bhagavan is not like Jiva. By his own will, he can manifest anytime, anywhere. There is no past baggage, there is no future baggage. It's a self-created, independent existence. That's it. It is not a force of karma. We have force of karma. Jiva has force of karma, so we take rebirth. So these two are very important aspects in Sanatan Dharma, and especially now in Advait, in Vedant philosophy, Avatarvad and Punarjanma. So there are many philosophies which believe in Punarjanma, but not many, all will believe in Avatar. Vedant philosophy believes in both Punarjanma as well as Avatar. Punarjanma means reincarnation of the Jiva, individual. Avatar means incarnation of Ishvara, of Bhagavan. So there is a big difference between these two. So can Bhagavan take avatar? Definitely he can take avatar. Being Nirgun Nirakar, if somebody says God can't take avatar, then you are putting limitations on that infinity. Infinity, who is in the form of, who is Ishvara, you are putting limitations on that. Can't do means what? Then there is no more infinite. Infinity has no limitations. But other religions, as well as some of our own philosophies, like some of the Arya Samajins and even the others, many will not believe in that avatar, because they will say that Bhagavan is Nirgun Nirakar only. So where is the question of him taking a form? Vedanta says no. Upanishads, Gita, Vedas themselves, they very clearly say that if the universe can be created by the Lord, all these forms are what? Separate from Bhagavan? No, they are the appearance of one only. If the whole ocean can manifest as so many waves, why can't it manifest as a special wave if required? That's not a difficult thing. So in the same way, if the whole universe can appear from the Supreme, Ishvara, then why can't Ishvara take a form? It's like saying the director of a movie cannot be a part of the movie. Who said so? Director of the movie has power to chuck out everybody in the movie and he alone can be there in the movie. That the power of the director is that or not? So Ishvara can take avatar. And whenever he chooses, he takes avatar. So many directors do that or not. If they choose, they will go into the movie also as a role, a character they will play. Otherwise, they don't. That's up to them. So in the same way here, God may not take is a different aspect. That is his will. But God cannot take is wrong, because when you are putting limitations on God, that God is not infinite anymore then. And so we should not have this wrong concept that if Bhagavan is formless, he can't take a form at all. Why? Because every form that you actually see is essentially formless in nature. It's a very beautiful point. Each of us right now, we have a form. But what were we before our birth? Can you think? We were in a formless state. Then we are manifesting in this form. Again, we will go back to formless state only. See, the sects that believe God can't take avatar, are they wrong? It's not a question of right or wrong. It's a question of evolution in their thinking. That's all. We don't judge. That's why the freedom of expression, the freedom of thinking is there in our culture. That these are different of thought. They are at a certain level of thought. When they come to a higher level, they will automatically realize that what they believed earlier was wrong from the higher standpoint. But the higher standpoint knowledge does not deny all the lower standpoints and say they are wrong, they are to be condemned, they are to be criticized, they are to be rejected. No, because that's the freedom of thought that they have. They are welcome to believe what they want to. That's the beautiful aspect of our culture. That's why it is so accommodative, because there is not one single an ideology which is imposed. You evolve to realize that ideology. That's the beautiful aspect. And should it not happen like that? It should happen as a natural progression. A fruit, how does the fruit come? The bud has to first bloom slowly as the flower, and then from the flower comes the fruit. These are stages of evolution. They are not wrong earlier. As a certain standpoint, they are thinking and they are living a life. When they study more, they reflect more, then they come to still broader perspective, it will keep evolving. You cannot give the direct absolute knowledge to somebody right in the beginning. You have to go through stages. So this is a process of evolution. That's how our culture has been so accommodative, because different levels of thought, like a non-believer and the person who has realized the absolute, both of them are able to coexist in this culture. Why? The person who has realized the absolute truth is not condemning a non-believer at all. Doesn't say that I have realized the truth, I know what it is, you are wrong. No. He or she is at that level of evolution. From there, we will try to explain and slowly lift. If they are ready, they will lift themselves. They will come up and they will realize themselves. How many non-believers have transformed into divine masters and great sages and saints because of this beautiful aspect of our culture? If they had been rejected as non-believer, if you are a non-believer, get out of this religion. Finish. That evolution of that person will never happen only. How many people we would have lost then? See the accommodativeness. What I'm trying to say is this is really called freedom of thinking, freedom of expression, that everybody can coexist with so-called contradictory thoughts. They are not contradictory. They are differences in the levels. So we respect all those. And we provide the logical reasoning, experiential proof of different levels, and each one is free to choose what they want to. According to their intellectual capability, slowly, they will rise higher and higher and higher. That's the beautiful aspect. So, I am coming back to this, that every form we see is actually formless. If there are any questions left out there, please ask in the Q&A session that we will have at the end of this. So every form we see is actually formless. Form is only a temporary manifestation in between. Like a pot, if you see, pot is created as a pot. From where? It was in the formless state as mud. Then it created as a pot. Then you break the pot, again it will go back to formless. Form is a temporary manifestation in between. So it is not that something new, absolutely unbelievable is being spoken of here. Each of us, we were in a formless state. Now we are in this form. Then this form will die. Again we die. Again we go back to formless. Again take another form. So this aspect of from unmanifest to manifest, from formless to form is called birth. From form to formless is what we call death. That's all. It's only a change of existence. It is not becoming completely extinct. And so, Bhagwan also, who is infinite, if Jiva, who is having a form, can be an expression of the formless, then why can't Bhagwan, who is formless, manifest? Example here again is this: water is a form, but it is in a formless state earlier. No? Hydrogen and oxygen, it doesn't have form. But you mix two molecules of hydrogen and oxygen, it will become a form. And if you heat it, again it will become formless. How beautiful is this? So we are so attached to the form, but our true nature is formless. It's amazing it is. We are really formless. Forget our body. Even at the mind level, you think our mind doesn't have one form. It takes the form of whatever thoughts we think. How amazing is that? How can something take a form of whatever it perceives until it is by itself formless? See, water, it is so liquid that you pour in any glass, it will take the form of that glass because it has that capability, that flexibility. So you put it in a cup, it will become like the cup. You put it in a glass, it will take the shape as though of the glass. You put it in the ice tray, it will become like, take the shape of the ice cubicles. In the same way, our mind by itself is formless, but it takes form of whatever it sees. So if you actually empty the mind of all forms, you will realize absolute. As simple as that is spiritual knowledge, but very difficult to practice because we got attached to form. So even we are like that. The point why I'm saying this is, if individuals can be from formless to formless, then why can't Bhagwan, who is formless, take an avatar? So we should not think that formless can't take an avatar. That is wrong notion. Wrong notion in the sense that is, from a higher standpoint, that notion is negated. That's all. Another example here is a log of wood. The fire is unmanifest. Then when some way that fire is manifested by friction or by lighting it from outside, then the fire which is unmanifest in the wood again manifests. Again it becomes unmanifest. When it is put off, it becomes ash. So this continuously happens in life, formless to formless. This is a cycle. Now, what I'm going to share here is one important video where a person is both a scientist as well as a theologist who has studied religion and spirit and science, both. And he's speaking. Of course, he has studied not Vedantic concept, but he has studied his religion, Christianity there. But beautifully he says that when we science says certain things, we are able to accept. But when we say that God is omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, we start thinking, oh, it's all mumbo jumbo. When we say Ishvara, we say Sarvajna, Sarvashaktiman, Sarvavyapi. Ishvara is this great Supreme Lord who is all present, all pervading, all powerful, all knowing. We start thinking that such entity does not exist, But when science says that, for ordinary things like matter, then we are ready to accept. If matter can be like that, then why can't infinite reality be like that? So listen to this carefully. Just a minute. Share here. So, yeah.
what is really real? Is the ground really here? We say that objects like the ground are composed of molecules, and those molecules are composed of atoms. Here's a simple illustration of the atom. You can see that in the center is the nucleus, and that has protons and neutrons. And around the nucleus are electrons. But you might also notice there's some void space or empty space in this atom. Can you estimate the percentage of void space in an atom? It's 99.9% void space. And actually, there's 13 nines after that decimal point. So the ground seems solid, seems like it's here, but it's nearly 100% nothing. Same goes for this stage, the seats, this whole auditorium. You know, and I know that in pop culture, they like to tell you that you're significant and you're a somebody, but in modern science, you're pretty much nothing. Tell that to your psychiatrist. Everybody has their own view of reality, whether a scientist, a philosopher, or a theologian. You see, philosophers and theologians, they debate abstract ideas, kind of like myself, and we wonder, what practical impact are they having on our day-to-day lives? And then we see scientists, like myself, and we're seemingly dispassionate people, and we sit in our labs and we do experiments. And we wonder, what contribution are we having to the deeper meaning of life? You see, I'm someone who holds graduate degrees in both science and theology. And I seek the nexus of both science and God, so that I'm neither dispassionate nor impractical. Famous scientist Sir Isaac Newton seemed to be able to put together these ideas. And he said the most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. But sadly, we have drifted from this point of view. You see, simply what I believe is that science and God, as I have understood them, go together. They're integrated. And even more so, with the advent of modern science in the last 100 years or so, it's actually helped us make some connections of those seemingly mystical qualities about God. I'd like to give you 3 examples to illustrate this. First one is probability. Probability in modern science is this interesting thing. You see, pretty much everything has a probability, whether it's the normal or the really unusual. Let me give you an example of one of those unusual things. You see, if we take the atom again, the atom, there's actually a probability that a particle in the atom can leave the atom and at the same time violate the law of conservation of energy. Now, the law of conservation of energy says that energy is neither created nor destroyed. Yet a particle in the atom, without having the energy to do so and no available energy, can overcome an energy barrier and just leave. That's the weirdness of probability. Now, why is this interesting theologically? Well, theologically, we wondered, well, how can God act in these seemingly miraculous ways? I mean, isn't it just magic and myth? For example, and there's plenty of them, God is described as omniscient, all-knowing outside of time, described as omnipresent, that is, everywhere present. And we wonder, how is this possible? But yet, what if there was a finite probability that God could act miraculously? And that's not impossible. And what if there's a possibility that God doesn't overstep the bounds of science, but actually works within the bounds of nature and science? You see, what I'm saying is this. If modern science tells us there's a probability for unusual activity happening, and we're okay with that, then we should not be as surprised that God could act and do miraculous things, and there's still a probability for that. Now, I'd like to hone in on 2 of these things that I just mentioned, that of omniscience and omnipresence, and use this in our second 2 examples. So next, the theory of relativity and our thought discussion of how that connects to omniscience. That is, God is outside of time and knowing all. Well, the theory of relativity came about in the 1900s by Einstein, and it's this theory that has been proven and described over and over throughout the decades. It has many facets, and the one we'll focus on is that between velocity and time. Simply said, the faster an object goes, the more lag in time you'll have. There's an interesting set of experiments that were done to illustrate this in 1971. They're the Hopfler-Keating experiments. They took a couple cesium beam atomic clocks. These are really accurate clocks. And they synchronized them. And they placed one on the ground and one in a commercial airliner that flew around and then later landed on the ground. Well, what did they find? The clocks were no longer synchronized. They were actually off by an order of nanoseconds, and that could be calculated from the theory of relativity. Which one was behind in time? The one that traveled faster on the airliner and later returned to Earth. Well, this idea can be expanded such that the faster you go, the slower time goes, until you reach your apex at the universal speed limit. That's the speed of light. And you know, at the speed of light travels so fast that time actually no longer progresses. You see, time is not a factor for light. Or we might say light is outside of time. Well, that's weird, I know, but that's a theory of relativity. Why is this interesting theologically? Well, theologically, we know that God describes himself and is described as light. And yet we wonder, how could God be omniscient, that is, outside of time and knowing all? You see, if consider God, we know he sees past, present, and future all at the same time and knows all. And that seems eerily similar and parallel to the idea that a photon can be outside of time. Now get me straight, I'm not saying that God is a photon. What I am saying is that in modern science, if it tells us that light can be outside of time, we should not be as surprised that God could be outside of time. Weird, I know, but let's keep going. Let's evaluate the third topic in modern science that I want to look at, and that's entanglement, and how that relates to the idea of omnipresence. Well, entanglement is this really interesting, strange idea that came about in 1935 by Einstein, Schrödinger, Rosen, and others. And let's say you have two particles, and they could really be photons, electrons, some molecules, various things. And if they're entangled or connected, a change in one will affect a change in another. Well, you think no big deal, but the interesting thing is you can separate them more and more and more, and they can still be entangled. You see, distance doesn't seem to be a relevant factor. This reached the furthest limit I've seen in 2012, published in the Journal of Nature, where these two entities were separated by 143 kilometers. That's 88 miles, and they were still connected and interacting with each other. That was the case of photon teleportation from one place to another, and that happened instantaneously. This was fictionalized in the TV and film series Star Trek, if you've heard of it. In Star Trek, they beam people up, and they're moving somebody from one place to another pretty much instantaneously, and the distance doesn't really matter. That's the idea of entanglement. Well, why is this interesting theologically? Theologically, we wondered, how could God be omnipresent? I mean, isn't that kind of weird? Well, if God is here and he's interacting with people, and those people could be separated a distance from him all around the world, somehow he's doing that instantaneously all the time. This also seems weirdly similar to the idea of entanglement. Get me right, again, I'm not saying that God's an entangled particle. What I'm saying is that if in modern science particles can interact with each other even while separated at a distance, we shouldn't be surprised that God can interact with humans, again, separated with a distance, and doing that instantaneously. Well, you might ask, so what? So what? Well, again, I believe that science and God, as I've understood them, are totally interconnected and integrated. And I know you're going to say, wait a minute, proofs by analogy are not proofs. And I know that. What I'm saying is, these seemingly mystical qualities about God that we thought were magic actually have an interesting precedent in modern science. You've seen this Erlenmeyer flask of boiling water on stage here for the last 10 minutes or so. And so I ask you, why is the water boiling? Okay, no doubt, you're going to say that the heat from the hot plate is being transferred into the liquid water. As the temperature increases, the kinetic energy increases, exciting the liquids in the liquid molecules in that liquid state to go out to the vapor state. The vapor pressure increases until it reaches atmospheric pressure, at which point nucleation points within the glass allow bubbles to form, overcoming the enthalpy of vaporization, and thus it boils. Duh. But actually, what I tell you is no, that's not really why the water's boiling. The water's boiling because I want some tea. Love tea. Tea's really good. Which answer is the correct one? You see, we actually need both the science explanation and the deeper meaning explanation to get the fuller picture of reality. Each answer is incomplete without the other, and really insufficient without the other. And it causes us to have a smaller understanding of what the reality is. Einstein put it this way: science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind. Now, I understand that Einstein didn't accept any conventional religion, for sure, but he was moved by some, quote, cosmic religious feeling. Many of you probably here today are academians or students, and you probably are focused on your academics, fields of study, and things like that, possibly without much regard to the deeper meanings of life. And what I'm saying is, maybe we're missing out on something. Maybe we need to work towards a reality that's a little bit bigger than that. So I ask you, what is really real?
So that was such a beautiful video. How he integrated it so beautifully. Just think about it, a photon can cross the barriers of time, and particles can be entangled and cross barriers of space. And when we say Brahman is beyond time, space, causation, then one wonders how can it be like this? And it's so nice that, the last analogy that he gave is amazing. He said one is to know the reason why the water is boiling, other is to know the purpose. It's boiling because I want tea. We need both these. Otherwise, one without the other is incomplete picture. Science and religion can go hand in hand, should go hand in hand. And our understanding of truth, God, reality, whatever you call it, becomes comprehensive when we blend both these properly. So that's why here, when we say that God is capable of taking a form, there should not be any doubts about that, because infinity can do that. Like he said, no, what is beyond, if it chooses to, it can be. There is no kind of limitations on this. And so, when somebody says that, oh Lord, why do you come? So the shloka number 7 now, most famous shloka. Yada yada hi dharmasya glanirбhavati bharata abhyutthanam dharmasya tadatmanam srijamyaham paritranaya sadhunam vinashaya cha dushkritam dharma samsthapanarthaya sambhavami yuge yuge. You must have heard this quite a few times, especially when those of us who have grown up listening to this Mahabharat, now recently the Mahabharat was telecasted also, B.R. Chopra's Mahabharat. They made these two verses very popular. So when does the Lord take avatar? And why does the Lord take avatar? These two questions are answered. And today we are celebrating avatar of Krishna, Janmashtami, so it's a very apt occasion for us to discuss this. So the 7th shloka says, when does he take avatar? 8th shloka says, why does he take avatar? So if you ask, why does he take avatar? Bhagavan says, Meri marzi, my will, my freedom, I will come when I want to, is my creation. Like the movie director says, I can take part in a movie. He comes out of love and compassion. Paritranaya sadhunam vinashaya cha dushkritam. To give darshan to so many sadhus who have been wanting to have his darshan, as well as to protect them from all evil forces which don't allow them to practice their dharma, and to destroy the adharmic tendencies and the forces. If he feels that there is no other option but he wants to come, then he comes. And everything doesn't have to be done only because of incompleteness or a problem. Bhagavan comes to celebrate also. Bhagavan comes even in good times, not only at bad times he comes. So many incarnations of the Lord have happened even at good times, to give darshan to people, to manifest for them, to bring happiness to the people. Like Vithala and Kundalik. Kundalik was not in some dire need, but Vithala Bhagavan manifested. So Bhagavan can manifest by his will, both at difficult times as well as at the good times. To fulfill the desires of the devotees, he comes. And when definitely there are major calamities, like in a country, small incidents and challenges, the local people or the chief minister, etc., will handle. But when there's a huge, massive national calamity, then Prime Minister himself will take the survey and figure out what has to be done. So it depends on many of these factors. Please remember, none of these are a limitation to God. We may try to put any reasoning why God manifests. These are only for us to try and understand. God can come at any time in spite of any circumstances. That we should never forget. Because he says in the earlier shloka, Prakritim swamavadhisthaya sambhavami atma mayaya. I take form by my will. So he is not bound by karma. Now here we will see the distinction between incarnation, that is avatar, and reincarnation, that is punarjanmavad. What is the difference here? In incarnation, Bhagavan controls Maya and comes out of his will. He is not a product of the Maya and the three gunas and the karma and the past desires. He is a controller of Maya. It is his power. Like we have the power to speak, listen, sing, walk, talk. We control that power. Same way, Bhagavan's Maya is the power which creates, sustains, and destroys, and he controls this Maya and he takes form. Or the individual controlled by Maya. Bhagavan comes out of his will and knowledge. We are compelled by vasanas. Even if we don't want to come, we will be forced to come. Like we saw in the 3rd chapter in the beginning. Even if we don't want to act, we will be compelled because of karma pressure. Bhagavan may come to establish dharma and destroy adharma. Jiva comes to exhaust one's own individual vasanas and to evolve. Bhagavan doesn't come to evolve. Bhagavan, every single moment, is aware of his or her divine nature. So his actions are divine, his birth is divine, and he is aware of it all the time. But Jiva is not aware. So Jiva thinks I am this limited being. So one acts selfishly, one hurts people, one does many things. So the birth of the Jiva becomes painful. Bhagavan's birth is never painful. Bhagavan gives joy and bliss to everybody, including the demons and the wicked forces whom he destroys. They also get a certain higher level of evolution. Out of compassion, Bhagavan helps them also to evolve. But Jiva goes through limited pleasure and pain and is caught in the cycle of birth and death. So these are broad differences between avatar and punarjanmavad. Why we should know this? Because knowing this, we become free. That we are actually one with the Supreme, just that we don't know. That's all. That clarity we will have when we understand that we are not the jiva, this body, mind, intellect is only a tool. We are essentially one with the Supreme. That knowledge is what liberates us. And Bhagavan comes to give that knowledge. So do you think it is the right time for God to come? Right now? One person has said yes. Yes, 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 now. Absolutely. Any time is right. That is true. From philosophy standpoint, any time is right. But suppose you say, all this, abhyuthanam adharmasya. Adharma is increased, dharma has gone through decline, then Bhagavan comes. Maybe towards end of Kali Yuga. Okay, so if we say it is right time to come, the question now here is, that's the point. It is his or her wish. It is Bhagavan's wish. Bhagavan is anyway beyond gender. It is Bhagavan's wish whenever Bhagavan wants to come. So who is to decide what is right time to come? Jiva or Bhagavan? Bhagavan decides when it is right time to come, he will come. Adharma has increased, there is no doubt. But the question is, he doesn't come only to destroy adharma. See, for him to come, there has to be genuine demand. How many people genuinely want Bhagavan to come? Those people will be very few. Majority don't want Bhagavan to come. They don't even believe in existence of Bhagavan. And Gurudev used to joke around. He used to say sometimes that God is a very decent guy. He doesn't crash anybody's party. He doesn't crash anybody's wedding. He doesn't crash into the creation also. So we may feel, yes, it is a adharma is increased, but for Bhagavan to manifest, there should be such virtuous, noble people who have done that tapasya to get Bhagavan as the child. As well as, if it is only unrighteous people, they will kill each other because unrighteousness can't survive. The world today is also surviving because of God only. Because of dharma, sorry. He is surviving because of dharma. But the dharmic people, in their heart, they pray for the Lord. So such dharmic people get individual avatar, what they call your customized avatar for you in your heart. The devotee has the darshan. That's how so many saints have realized the truth. But collectively, the avatar is not happening outside. Why? Because collective demand is not there. He comes when there is a demand. When really people want him to come, then he comes. How many people really want him to come? There are very few who want him to come. Majority is happy that he doesn't come because they want to continue their wrong way of thinking and living. So when does the Lord come? He comes when these two factors are there, when dharma goes through decline and adharma rises. Now this has to be thought through clearly. When dharma goes through decline, so we have understood dharma means that which binds, unites, integrates everything. Dharana dharma, dharyate iti dharma. What is that which unites everything? Is love. Every single being is united only by true love. And this cosmic rhythm which is there in the universe is because of love. Adharma means when there is disturbance in this rhythm. So what binds everybody, unites, integrates, that is dharma, and that is love. When love reduces in the hearts of people, I am not talking about love only as some boy-girl love. No. The feeling of loving the whole creation, the feeling of being sensitive to everybody because there is a feeling of oneness that we all are expressions of one divine truth, or we all are living beings, whatever level one wants to understand, but one should see oneness. So when love declines, when performance of duties decline, that is called decline of dharma. When vision of oneness declines, where there is oneness, there will be love. Where there is love, there will be duties. Where there is duty, there will be values. These four are in a sequence. Please don't forget this sequence. Vision of oneness. When we identify with each other as all living beings, then we will not be violent to other living beings. But today we don't identify. To kill one animal is fine, to kill other is not fine. That is such hypocrisy. All are living beings, all have right to live. How can you kill one and not, and say that others are okay, I can kill this? That's wrong. All living beings are one. So when the identification goes to higher levels, then we don't do violence, we don't do adharma, we follow values, we do our duties, we live in harmony. You can do this oneness at any level. Suppose we say all human beings, then forget black, brown, white, how does it matter? But how much violence happens in the name of color of the skin, pigmentation of the skin? Because the vision of oneness is not there. As a country, citizens of this country, so we all are Bharatiyas. Now, whether it is a Tamilian or a Punjabi or a Assamese or a Rajasthani, it doesn't matter. From India's standpoint, we all are Bharatiyas, and we are citizens of this country. We dedicate ourselves to uplift this country, to lift it to greater heights. But now each state says, I want autonomy, and they are fighting for the, we want to break away from the country. Then where will be dharma there? So highest will be vision of oneness. Wherever I see oneness, there will automatically be love. And if I say I am belonging to this country, I will love everybody in this country. I don't outcast anybody. I don't exclude anybody. Wherever I go, this is my country. How nice life would be when we live out of the vision of oneness. Human being creates these divisions and then wants control, wants power, becomes selfish, becomes greedy, becomes violent. That's the downfall. That is called adharma. So these four things we should never forget. Vision of oneness brings love. Love brings duties. Duties will bring values. I will follow good values like non-violence, compassion, forgiveness, truth, all those. The decline of these is what we call as decline of dharma. And increase of selfishness, increase of division, increase of, flouting the duties and norms and not following values. That is called increase of adharma. So vision of division increases, selfishness increases, love decreases. Naturally, there is immorality, there is corruption, there is no loyalty in relationships. I don't want to do my duties. No values I want to follow. All about I, me, mine, how much money, how much power, how much fame. That's it. This, when it is happening in the majority, Bhagwan doesn't have to come for this because they will destroy themselves. Bhagwan comes when there are people who are struggling against this and genuinely wanting to live, and they are putting all their efforts. Bhagwan does send different people, different masters to help them, encourage them, who again revive. So even now in Kali Yuga, we are in the beginning part of Kali Yuga. It is not that the last century also, how many great saints and masters and others have come to revive. So Bhagwan takes form in those ways also to help. That is called Adhyatmika Avatar of Bhagwan. In a Jiva who has evolved, that Jiva gets darshan of Bhagwan, and then that Jiva spreads oneness to everybody, love to everybody, values to everybody. So Bhagwan's avatar is happening even in Kali Yuga right now when the need is there. It's not that it's not happening. But if we say Bhagwan has to come as Bhagwan, that Bhagwan decides. If there's real demand in the majority, then he comes. So when we say Dharma Samsthapanarthaya Sambhavami Yuge Yuge, what does that mean? It does not mean just start a new religion, new organization. If need is there, you start. There is no problem with that. But Dharma Samsthapana doesn't mean start a new religion. Doesn't mean that you convert people to your religion. Why? I am doing Dharma Samsthapana. My Dharma must be followed across the world. Why you are imposing yourself? Live and let live. That's it. That simple philosophy. Why can't you just follow? So many Eastern cultures followed that philosophy of live and let live. But these other religions, then they want to impose, then we are stuck. And we don't want that imposition to happen, then we have to fight back. In spite of we valuing ahimsa as the supreme dharma, when we have to fight to protect ourselves in defense, we will have to do. There is no choice. How sad it is that so many Hindus, even today, they say that I am ashamed that Ram Mandir is being built. So they think that Ram Mandir is built by demolishing Babri Masjid. But they are not seeing that Babri Masjid was built demolishing Ram Mandir. What about that? Who will hold people responsible for that? I'm not saying that what happened in terms of demolition, that act is to be encouraged. No, but we waited, no? For how many years we waited, and the court decision has come. Now we are following according to that court's decision properly. Still, if you say we are ashamed, that means what? That means we are not respecting the Supreme Court verdict also. And the collective majority of this country is Hindu, is secular, because in that sense secular that we accommodate everybody. We have not, everybody who is persecuted across the world has found their refuge in India, and we have welcomed everybody, accommodated everybody here. Tell me one country where the invaders who have come and attacked and loot and plundered and murdered and all that, and there are roads in their names, there are stations in their names, there are cities in their names, but we have or not? And we still have all those people living here also. Why? Because the inherent faith, the Sanatan Dharma, is that we all are accommodative. We don't impose. We live and let live, thrive. But if you attack me in my self-defense, I have to fight, then don't say that I am doing anything wrong. Because if somebody comes into my house and attacks me and tries to kill my family, I have to fight for it, I will fight. Same way it applies to the whole nation. And that fight also is still happening in such many places in democratic ways only. Kashi and Mathura also are still pending, and we are still waiting. We are not in any violence. We are still waiting. When clear evidences are there, those were our sacred temples. And can anybody say, just build a hospital and school? It's not an ordinary place. It is a birthplace of Ram and Krishna and our Kashi Vishwanath. And we have sat quietly. No? We are just saying for 3 temples. Thousands of temples have been destroyed. Are we saying all those temples we are going to reclaim? No, 3. Why can't there be harmony? Just say, okay, let the Hindus have these 3. That's about it. Issue is settled. But no. We should remember these aspects and understand the context properly. So converting people, imposing ideologies, that is not Dharma Samsthapana. From our standpoint, that is not Dharma Samsthapana. Nor is it just doing rituals or blindly doing duties. Then what is Dharma Samsthapana? Strengthen the vision of oneness. Krishna came here not to start Vaishnavism. He did not start any Vaishnavism newly. He gave the knowledge of oneness. He strengthened people's identification with the totality. He made them realize that we are expressions of one divine truth. Learn to love each other, respect each other, accommodate each other. And where he found that the adharmic forces are not able to do that, and he felt that he has to ensure that those forces are destroyed, it has to be done. If there is an amputation required for a limb of the body to save the whole body, it has to be done. A doctor intelligently will do it to save the whole body. So adharmic forces were all gathered in one place in the Kurukshetra, and the dharmic forces destroyed all of them. I am giving this example only in context of Kurukshetra and what Krishna did. I am not meaning in any other sense or any other religion or anything else right now. But I already said that to impose and to convert or to kill is not our culture. But to defend is our culture. There's no doubt. So to establish dharma meaning strengthen the vision of oneness, manifest the power of love, make people love each other and respect each other, remove fear from lives of people. That is called Dharma Samsthapana. Then what will happen? Automatically duties will happen, love will be there, values people will follow, harmony will be there, and only in harmony can there be real progress and prosperity. If we go on fighting, we'll destroy ourselves. So many countries, you just look at them. If the whole philosophy is only about fight, there can't be progress. Progress can happen, development can happen when there is peace. And that is what is called Dharma Samsthapana. So when he says Dharma Samsthapanarthaya Sambhavami Yuge Yuge, in every yuga I will manifest. This is what Bhagavan does. He doesn't come to kill. Kamsa and all these asuras he could have killed by his thought. Ravana he could have just killed by his thought. 14 years may only 1 year went in the last year of exile, this Ravan Leela happened. 13 years was where he's sharing knowledge, he's giving darshan to rishis, he is having satsangs, he is establishing the feeling of oneness in everybody. All that is called Dharma Samsthapana. So an avatar will do that. So when does he take form? He takes form when this dharma declines and the adharma rises. And what is Dharma Samsthapana? Strengthening vision of oneness. So Krishna is the avatar of Lord Vishnu himself. 8th avatar of Lord Vishnu is Bhagavan Krishna. And today we do celebrate Janmashtami as the avatar of Bhagavan Krishna. And the whole life of Krishna is so attractive, so inspiring, that in spite of what all problems life gave him, he still lived a life of absolute bliss, joy, happiness. Nobody can say that Krishna's life was miserable or Krishna was a weakling or Krishna was sad or depressed, when there are reasons enough for him to be sad or depressed, actually. Right before his birth onwards, his parents are tortured, his siblings are killed. When he is born in a jail. Then he is separated from parents at birth. Then his own uncle is trying to kill him when he is 3 or 4 days old. He sends Putana. Then Dhenukasur, Bakasur, Shakatasur, Trinavarta, so many of them, one by one they come. And the people whom he loves the most, the Gopas, Gopis, Radha, Yashoda Maya, Nanda Baba, he is there with them for some years, and after that when he leaves Gokul, he doesn't go back to Gokul. Think about it. Every single moment of his life, there have been so many challenges, so many difficulties, but he still is living as an embodiment of happiness and bliss. Why? Because rooted in the knowledge that there is one pure consciousness and that alone is real, and he came to give that knowledge to everybody. So as we celebrate Janmashtami today, we should invoke the Adhyatmic avatar of Bhagavan, that, oh Lord, may my mind become like Vasudev's. Sharp and subtle intellect is Vasudev and pure devoted mind is Devaki. When both these come together, then Krishna is born. And our heart is like that prison house, dark. And our own attachments are binding us. Bhagavan, when he takes birth, all those bondages, they just break free and we are liberated from samsara. So avatar of Bhagavan comes for uddhar of the jiva. May the Lord be born in hearts of all of us. So wish you all once again a very happy Janmashtami. Try to understand Krishna, try to understand his life, his vision, how did he live, and try to live by the values and the Gita way of life that he spoke. So for today, I will stop here. Anybody has any questions, then please, you are welcome to raise your hand and one by one you can ask. I'm not reading the chat because there are quite a few things. So if you have asked any question there, just raise your virtual hand here and unmute, and then you ask. Okay, no questions. Fine. So we continue next week. The link that we have sent on the WhatsApp group as well as the Telegram group, that is the link which we will use for all the sessions now. So please follow that. The email that was sent earlier by Zoom when you registered, but many people are not able to access that. They have lost that email, or so many other emails have come, it has gone somewhere. So we thought, okay, we will create this simple link and you can use that now. Shabarish has raised his hand. Okay.
Hari Om Swamiji.
Yes, Hariom.
Swamiji, everything is due to cause and effect, right? So what is the cause of increase of adharma in every yuga?
Those three causes that we saw, no, the mind has become weak, the senses have no control, and the intellect is not rooted in knowledge. That's the cause.
Okay. Thank you, Swamiji.
Kushal Patel has a, you can't find a hand. There will be a symbol there, no, in the bottom. There's a blue hand which you can raise. Okay, so I have asked you to unmute. You can unmute and ask the question.
My question is that I've read theories of some other academic scholars who believe in the fact that Kali Yuga will end in 2082, like it's close to its end actually, and it's actually the yugas are much smaller than what people believe they are. So do you think this is true?
No, I don't know what references they have, so I can't comment on that. But from what we have studied in our scriptures and Bhagavatam, etc., and the calendar that we follow, based on that, it is just the very initial beginning of Kali Yuga. When Krishna departed from this world, Kali Yuga started. We are
So
just
then,
3,000th year now, and Kali Yuga time is supposed to be 4,32,000 years of human life. Human life, 4,32,000 years is Kali Yuga. So it is a long time to go, is what our understanding of scripture says.
but already dharma is perishing in the world in many places. It's also reviving in the world in many places. I'm seeing rebirth of dharma in many places. But if it's also perishing so much already in so few years, then how will the world even survive so many years of Kali Yuga?
It will happen that just like you said now, okay, there's revival also happening, there's perishing, this cycle goes on and it will reach its, what we call, culmination at some point in the end of Kali Yuga, where if you see the description, they are terrible. Already some descriptions are happening, but more and more and more it will keep happening. So, but it is going to, the scriptures say that this is how it is going to go on for some time, and it's a downward trend. In between, you will see some spurts happening, but that will sustain it for some time. Again, the downward trend happened because it's more easy to fall for the senses in Kali Yuga.
And last part that it says that Kalki, the last incarnation of Bhagavan Vishnu, comes in the end of Kali Yuga. But then Sri Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita that he himself is coming. So like, it's how do you understand it, like an avatar, or it's like Sri Krishna coming in another form or what?
We just spoke in the class in the beginning that Krishna speaks from 4 standpoints. When he says Sambhavami Yuge Yuge, obviously he's not saying Krishna is going to come every yuga. Ishvara is manifested as Krishna. Ishvara will again manifest as Kalki avatar. Ishvara manifested earlier as Matsya avatar, Kurma avatar, Varaha avatar, all that. It is not Krishna as Krishna manifesting in all those, right? So it is like that. So Ishvara will manifest, which is the creator, who is the creator. That Ishvara manifests. By his will, he manifests. So it will happen like that. So there's no contradiction there. When he says Yada Yada Dharmasya, that shloka is not from Krishna's standpoint. That shloka is from Ishwar's standpoint. That's why I clarified these 4 standpoints. So whenever we have such doubt, we should always ask ourselves, from which standpoint is this shloka speaking? Is it from Brahman's standpoint, Ishwar's standpoint, Krishna's standpoint, Guru's standpoint? Which shloka? Which standpoint? Kartika P. Yeah.
Hari Om Swamiji, I wanted to ask, we are born to exhaust our vasanas, right? We get our form to exhaust our vasanas. Then what was there before the vasanas were formed? Like, why were we born at all?
Now that question is in time, and it has a lot of assumptions that there is a purpose why we are born. Number one. Number two, that creation is real, and this birth is absolutely real, and the purpose has to be real. These are assumptions in that question. Vedant, when we inquire into, like he said, that the scientist also said that the ground appears very real, but it is 99.99 and 13 decimals are there. It is void space. It is not at all real. So when we think this body is real, this world is real, then we want to know what is its real purpose and what was the first reason. Time itself is a product of intellect. When intellect is not functioning, time is not there for us. In the deep sleep, there is no question of time. When two thoughts arise, then only time starts. We are asking which was the first vasana because of which these thoughts arose. So it is impossible. Time is a product of thoughts. You are asking about the beginning. That's because our intellect is conditioned to think of the beginning always. But these things are beginningless. So there are only two answers for this. At a lower level, we say there is no beginning. This has been going on for beginningless time, which is what scientists like Stephen Hawking also concluded finally, that universe has no beginning. So either we say that there is no beginning, it is beginningless time, it is going on as a cycle, it is going on. So there's nothing called first vasana, first thought, first reason. It's just going on. That's a simpler level explanation. The deepest level explanation Vedanta is saying is even ask whether this is real. Did the snake really produce the rope? Sorry, did the rope really produce the snake? When I don't see the rope clearly in the evening, let us say, light is not sufficient, I think there is a snake. Now my assumption is that snake is real, and then I am scared of that snake. But if you question, put a torchlight and see, you realize that snake was not there at all. It's only a rope. Same way, when we really inquire into the cause of things and we say what is actually real, then we come to realize that there is only one infinite consciousness that alone is real. The whole creation, time, space, causation, sequence, logic is all illusory, just like in a dream. The whole dream world appears very real, but it's illusory. When you wake up, you realize it didn't happen. So it's like that. Some of you are not able to raise your hand. I don't understand why. You have to look at the black bar at the bottom, and if there is a more, the sign of more will be there. If you click on that, there will be those options to raise your hand in case you are accessing through phone and you are not able to find. One question has come: if karmic account does not affect Lord and his incarnation, then how Lord Krishna was killed by Jara, rebirth of Bali from hiding in the bush, because earlier Lord Ram killed Bali the same way? So good question. The point is that Bhagwan chooses to take a karmic debt in that instance. It's not that he is bound by karma. Bhagwan chose, okay, fine. In this incarnation I did this. In this incarnation I will do in this way. That's all. There is no vasana in that at all. Like a director, you see, in a first movie, the director may play a certain role. In the sequel, the director may try to, compensate for it here. So it's just like that. It's by will it happens. It's not by karmic account. When we say karma, then there is a helplessness involved in that. That whether you like it or not, it is going to happen in that way. That is called karmic bondage. Bhagwan is not bound by karma, but Bhagwan may choose to take up certain karma and get it exhausted if he wants to, and try to, show to the jivas also the impact of karma or the result of any action that we do. It's just for the sake of the people to understand that karma has consequences. So we should learn to be careful. But he is not bound by any of those karmas. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great Janmashtami and live the Gita way of life. We meet next week. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Harihi Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Harihi Om. See, our topic for next week will be the Varna Vyavastha. What today people call as caste system. That comes in the Gita. The next topic, it will lead to that. So if you have anything to think about it, please think about it. That what is this Varna Vyavastha? Do your research, find out. And also think about the question that should the Varna Vyavastha be abolished? And we will discuss more in the next class. Thank you.